All right, welcome to part 3. Just to refresh your memory, yesterday I described a computational architecture, a feed-forward hierarchical model, which I try to convince you is sufficient to explain a number of basic neuroscience facts that we've been accumulated for the past 50 years or so. I've tried to convince you that the architecture is a special case of a more general class of models, but that the particular one that I showed you was able to essentially bridge the gap from what we understand about the detailed properties of neurons along the ventral stream all the way to explaining human behavior, not during natural everyday vision when you're free to move your eyes, shift your attention, but during one of those rapid animal or rapid object categorization tasks during which your visual system is constrained to operate in a bottom-up feed-forward sweep. And just to refresh your memory, I've highlighted a number of limitations associated with this kind of coarse initial base representation that this architecture is building. So I've told you that it's sufficient to enable the what is there kind of task, but it's insufficient, and we have experimental evidence for that, for object localization. And it's also sensitive to clutter. So why is that the case? Well, I think there is a very simple explanation for that, and I think these limitations due to clutter is actually a very general properties of this class of models. I think it's going to happen for any kind of such architectures which tries to build a very generic dictionary of visual features which is shared across object categories. So here's an example, a toy world, where we try to discriminate between 3 letters, L, E, and F. Our assumption is that we're going to be building a visual representation based on a population code of the type that I described yesterday. You can think of that as a small population of IT-like cells. So those cells have a receptive field, which is represented here. And they are tuned to various kinds of features, simple orientations, combinations of orientations. And they have some built-in tolerance with respect to position and scale. So these units respond to their preferred stimulus anywhere within this small part of the region of their receptive field. And I've tried to argue that this is an efficient way to represent visual object categories because of these built-in invariances. If you're a visual system and you want to build or learn a new object categories, it's possible to do that from a handful of training examples by simply reading out the activity of this population here. And so we've done experiments, we've shown that the approach works well, and it's possible in this way to recognize object categories in a way which is tolerant to position and scale. Now the problems start when we start presenting multiple stimuli. Because as you can see here, our population of cells will fire in response to features that they find in different parts of the visual system, of their receptive fields. And it's going to lead to potentially wrong associations between these kinds of features. And in particular, in this example, our visual system would hallucinate an hybrid between an L and an F, which is an E letter. Okay. So the argument that I'd like to make is that any kind of such architecture will require some kind of attentional spotlights, some way to essentially focus processing on only one part of the visual field as opposed to a very large chunk of your field of view. And here is why Spotlight would help you. Essentially, if you have a way to focus process on only one object of interest, like this L letter, and suppress everything that's going on in the surround, in the clutter, then we are back to something that we know. The effect would be that in turn you would turn off the spurious detections here associated with the F letter, and then in turn being able to recognize the L letter. Okay? All right, so what I want to do during this hour is 2 things. First, I want to show you some the results of a monkey electrophysiology study that we did in collaboration with the lab of Bob Desimon at MIT, which was specifically testing this prediction. And I'll show you that the result, the prediction tested fine. And I should emphasize that this is work done by Zhang, who did the electrophysiology, and Ethan Meyers that did the data analysis. And then I'll spend about 60% of the remaining of the lecture giving you some specific details, implementation about a model of attention that tries to justify or explain how cortical feedback could be added to this feed-forward architecture to enable attentional shift and circumvent many of the problems that I described. All right, so the experiment we did is a standard readout experiment. I'm not going to give you too many details because I gave you two examples already yesterday. Pretty much the monkey was, is fixating in front of a computer screen. We stick electrodes at the level of the inferior temporal cortex, which would be for this monkey somewhere around here. We record from a small population of neurons and then pass, for every point in time, we pass the output of this population of cells to a linear classifier. We try to predict the identity or the category of the stimulus that we present. We compare this prediction to a true label, and then from there assess a level of performance or accuracy for this classifier. And that tells us how well the information of interest is represented by this population of cells. So here was the task, a number of discrete time points. The monkey was trained to first fixate on this dot here. At time 0, an array of stimulus appears. That could be either 1 or 3 stimuli. The size of the stimuli was such, although we didn't precisely map out the receptive fields, the size of the stimuli was such that they should be, in principle, fit within the receptive fields of typical IT neurons. Then the monkey was cued to attend to one of these 3 objects. In this example, this is done with the monkey is cued to attend to a sofa. And then after a while, there is a change happening on the target object here. In this specific experiment, we had a change whereby the stimuli went from a grayscale stimulus and actually getting color. So it goes from grayscale to color. Okay? And the monkey is trained to make a fixation onto the target as soon as the stimulus is undergoing the change. Okay? Now, on half of the trials, rather than the target changing appearance, this would be one of the distractors. Okay? And the monkey was trained to hold fixation and only move its eyes if only if the target was changing its appearance. Okay? So any change on the distractor doesn't count. All right, so the basic experiment was as follows. We trained a classifier to try to predict the identity of the objects being presented when the objects were presented in isolation. And then the critical test here is the ability of the classifier to generalize to multiple stimuli. Okay? And in particular, we're going to be focusing on several experimental conditions. The first one is we're going to be testing in when the stimulus is presented in isolation, which is kind of our baseline. We're going to be comparing that to the presentation of multiple stimuli, so that's the cluttered condition. And in particular, we're going to be comparing cases where we try to decode the identity of the stimulus corresponding to the location at which that was cued, the location at which the monkey is actively attending, as opposed to the non-attended location. Okay? So here's the main result. On the x-axis is time in milliseconds. On the y-axis is performance measured by the area under the ROC curve. We just did a binary test, essentially target present or absent. So here's the stimulus display. In blue, it corresponds to the decoding performance here when a single stimulus is presented. So that's our baseline condition. As you see, shortly after the stimulus appears, the decoding ramps up to a point where it essentially saturates around 100 milliseconds or so, which corresponds to typical latencies in this area. You see that the level of decoding is relatively good, about 85%, given that we are recording from only a small population of cells. This should be contrasted with the more interesting cases, here this green and red curve, which correspond to cluttered condition. Okay, so you see that our prediction was correct. We can decode reliably when the stimulus is presented in isolation, but as soon as there is several stimuli within the receptive fields, the decoding drops down significantly. We didn't quite get to chance level, but I think it would be easy to bring down the level of performance by adding more stuff in the receptive field, essentially. Now, the critical condition is this one. What you can see here is that at around the time where we cue the animal to attend to one of the 3 stimuli, so in red is the condition when the monkey is attending to the location for which we are trying to decode the identity of the stimulus. you see that after a short time period, you see that the decoding starts to increase gradually, okay? And in about 500 milliseconds, we reach a level of decoding which is essentially identical to the level of decoding that we are getting for the objects presented in isolation. Okay, so I think the explanation for that is if you think of the classifier as a way to measure the similarity between a training pattern and a test pattern, the best explanation is that the attention makes the test stimulus looks more like the training stimulus, and in a sense this makes it look like it was presented in isolation. So I think it's a good test of prediction, and in a sense the fact that attention essentially suppresses the background clutter and makes the stimulus look as if it was presented in isolation. Just a control here in green corresponds to the condition where the monkey is attending to a location which is away from the stimulus that we are trying to, from where we are trying to decode, and you see that the decoding goes actually in the opposite direction. Okay. All right. Similarly, we showed that something similar happens for when we try to decode location information. So you see that here, if we try to predict which one of the three possible locations is our target located, you see that when the target is presented in isolation, we can do that quite well. And that's because you can imagine that we're decoding from a population of cells for which the receptive fields are not perfectly overlapping. And so they are tiling some part of the space, and naturally a classifier is able to interpolate between those receptive field locations and from there localize the target. Conversely, as predicted in the cluttered condition, you see that we are very close to chance here. And as soon as we cue the attention of the monkey to the location of the target, then you see that the decoding for position information also increases. Okay. So in that case, the experiment suggests that attention solves two problems. One is decoding in clutter of object identity, and the second one is decoding the location of the object. Now, something that came out of this experiment, which was not the main purpose of the experiment, but I think it's a cool result, is the following. So what we did on this plot is essentially to align, so to essentially try to decode the identity of both the object, the target object, and the distractor. And for that, we align the decoding time course onto the change of the distractor. Okay, so what we do here is that we consider only the trials for which, not the target, but the distractor underwent the change. Okay? And what you can see is the following. In red is we are trying to decode the identity of the target, and this is before the distractor changed its appearance. The monkey is cued to the object location, so everything is going well. The decoding performance is going up. Okay? Conversely, the decoding performance for the distractor is going down. This is because the monkey is actually attending to the target. What is really interesting is what's happening when the distractor is starting to change. Remember that the monkey is trained to specifically hold fixation and not do anything when the distractor is undergoing the change, right? So the monkey's life or his ability to get a reward depends on his ability to fixate. What you see here is that soon after the distractor starts changing, the decoding performance for the attended object starts to decrease. At the same time, you see that the decoding performance for the distractor, which was very close to chance in the first place, starts to ramp up. So what's going on here? Well, the monkey is being asked to pay attention to the stimulus, which is right there, and there is something going on right there. Okay, and that's something that's capturing the monkey's attention. So even though the monkey wants to pay attention there is this annoying exogenous cue that's trying to grab its attention. And so what seems to be happening is that the monkey can help, but shifts its attention to the distractor, and then as quickly as possible, then the monkey goes back to the target. All right, so just to summarize this first part, I've consistent with the prediction we had in the first place related to fit-forward hierarchical models, I've shown you that in the absence of attention, information about the identity of individual objects and their location in clutter is greatly reduced relative to when objects are shown in isolation. What I've tried to suggest is that attention seems to restore the pattern of neural activity toward the vector representing the isolated objects. As a secondary result, I've shown you that in spite of this nearly exclusive representation of the attended object, again under the assumption that what attention does is suppress the clutter, an increase in the salience of the non-attended object overrode these attentional enhancements, at least for a short time. And then overall, I hope that these results provide a computational level explanation for how attention operates on neural representation to solve the problem of invariant recognition in clutter. All right, so what I want to do in the remaining of this lecture is now to try to, given that we've assessed the existence of attentional mechanisms as a way to overcome or to permit decoding from these types of fit-forward hierarchical architecture in clutter, I want to show you an initial attempt that we've made in terms of integrating this cortical feedback and shifts of attention onto the original initial model that I described yesterday. And so I think when we think about cortical feedback, a natural source of inspiration is Bayesian inference. And of course, starting all the way back from Helmholtz, there is a very long tradition of researchers who have been casting the problem of visual perception in terms of Bayesian inference. So very briefly, the framework suggests that the visual system would be making image measurements. And so I showed you examples of the kinds of image measurements that the visual system could be doing. This could be taking the form of detecting various kinds of features at different orientations, combinations of orientations, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to be assuming that there is a high-level variable, S, visual scene description, which is responsible for generating images. And the goal of visual perception is, given some image measurements, try to figure out the most likely values for this scene description. So in other words, one way to solve this problem is to assume a model of image formation. This is something that Bruno discussed a couple of days ago. We're going to be assuming a model of image formation as well as making assumption about prior on natural visual scenes. All right, so typically such a high-level scene variable could be taking a number of forms. One simple form that it could take is perhaps a list of all the objects that are present in the image, their identity and their location. Okay. Now, in the most general case, especially because natural scenes can contain a lot of various objects, in the most general case, these variables can be quite dependent on one another, and hence making the inference process quite complex. So what I'm going to try to show you in the next couple of slides is that if we take into account, and if we make simplifying assumptions, taking into account the anatomy and the physiology of the visual system, we'll get to a very simplified model of image formation, which makes the inference process much simpler. So the first hypothesis we're going to be making is the existence of an attentional spotlight. And I think, hopefully by now, I convinced you of that. This was based on the IT experiment that I just described. So we're going to be making the assumption that in order to recognize and localize objects in a scene, the visual system needs to select objects one at a time. Okay? And so for instance here, this would be for instance suggesting that in order to process this complex visual scene, the visual system will be attending to each object one at a time in succession. Okay? In other words, we're going to be caring only about estimating the joint probability distribution between three variables, the object location. So I should say that the further assumption we are making is that the visual system only cares about two variables, the location of the spotlight and the identity of the object contained within the spotlight. Which means that we're going to be caring about the joint probability distribution between this O variable corresponding to the object identity, the location of the object, and the image measurements. A second hypothesis that we're going to be making is that somehow our visual system is composed of two independent streams of processing. Okay, that's something that I discussed yesterday a little bit. It's customary to assume that the visual system can be decomposed into a ventral what stream, which is the stream that I described yesterday, which is involved in our ability to recognize objects and process shape information, as opposed to a more dorsal stream, which is involved in the explicit representation of location information in visual scenes. Okay, so one way to think of that is perhaps a saliency map that would explicitly encode interesting locations in an image. So our graphical models can be further simplified. We're assuming independence between our object identity variable and location variable. The last and third assumption we're going to be making is pretty much building on the work that I described yesterday. We're going to be assuming that there is not a direct link between image measurements and the identity of objects, but instead there are intermediate stages whereby we're going to be assuming a retinotomic representation something like combinations of orientations, but organized in a retinotopic grid at multiple scales. This corresponds to the intermediate stages of the computational model that I described yesterday. And we're going to be assuming very specific pooling mechanisms from these intermediate stages in V4 onto higher stages. Okay? And we're going to be assuming that the response of every one of these feature maps is pulled together to lead to a IT-like representation whereby the units are tolerant to position and scale. Okay? So just for the aficionados, this would be the S2 units in our model, and this would be the C2 units. All right, so here's the final graphical model we ended up with. We're assuming a high-level object identity variable, which would be encoded somewhere maybe outside the visual system, maybe somewhere in the prefrontal cortex. I showed you category selective units yesterday. Or perhaps somewhere in the hippocampus, which is a set of area related to memory. We're going to be assuming that this object variable essentially is made of a collection of features which are tolerant to position and scale. This in turn feed into a set of retinotopic feature maps where those features are replicated across scales and position. And this is responsible for generating the image. We're also going to be assuming a location L variable somewhere in the parietal areas, which is also going to be acting on these XI variables. Something that I forgot to mention, but which is a critical simplifying assumption, is that we're going to be assuming that those XI features are conditionally independent given the spotlight, meaning given the object identity and the location here, which again is a very strong assumption. All right, one last point of detail. We needed to make an extension to our original model in order to include a parietal areas here to encode this location variable. And so the way we did that is simply by building what I would call saliency maps, whereby we considered essentially cortical columns in V4 and via non-selective synaptic weights essentially summed up their activity. Okay, so this pixel location here, for instance, would correspond to the output of all these feature responses. Okay. Yes.
Question about this your previous.
Yeah. This one.
Yeah. So in the clutter part of your, so if I take your cartoon literally, if I show L and F, I see E essentially. Then what does it mean to attend? I mean, the object level sees E, right?
I'll try to answer that in the next couple of slides. But if I don't, please ask the question again. So the short answer is that attending in this framework will be akin to conditioning high-level variables here, something like the O letter or the O variable or the L variable. I'll try to be more specific. Right, but so I don't know if this part is clear, but so the basic idea is that by summing up the activity across cortical columns, you can build something that looks like a saliency map. We're going to be building populations of neurons that respond whenever there is stuff presented in their receptive field, irrespective of the kind of stuff that's being presented, which is in sharp contrast with the kind of selectivity we get in the ventral stream, where the neurons actually don't explicitly represent location information and only care about the stuff that's being, the specific stuff that's in the receptive field, irrespective of where it is. Okay? All right, so within this framework, the goal of visual perception is to estimate posterior probabilities of visual features, objects, and their locations in an image. As I'll show you, within this framework, attention corresponds to conditioning on high-level latent variables representing particular objects or locations, and of course, as well as sensory inputs, which correspond to the presentation of images, and doing inference on the other latent variables. So essentially, this Fi and Xi here. Here we use belief propagation to solve the inference problem. There is no particular reason for that, besides the fact that there has been quite a few proposals for how this could be done in a biologically plausible manner. But in principle, the model is agnostic about the algorithm used to make inference. Okay, so what this architecture makes is an interesting prediction for the type of interactions across areas, and in particular, what should be happening for the kinds of modulation in area V4. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the response of these xi units here. One can see, so this is the how what their response should be, and so there are three terms here in these types of response. We see that the first term corresponds to a feed-forward input. Okay, how much evidence we get from the bottom-up sweep. A second term is what we call the suppressive drive. Okay, this comes from interactions across units within the same area. And you can think of that as interactions at the level of lateral connections, for instance. I would say this is related to some of the things we've been discussing that I discussed yesterday and Marco Aurelio discussed the day before. You can think of that, these types of suppressive drive can be implementing with shunting inhibition. Okay, so this is a normalization operation. And as Marco Aurelio showed, this is actually quite important even in the bottom-up feed-forward sweep. What is interesting here is that within the context of a probabilistic model, of course, this normalization, makes sense because that's the way to get probability distributions to sum up to 1, essentially. And then there's a third term, which I would call the attentional modulation. Okay, so there are a couple of terms within this attentional modulation. This P of xi given fi and L is not that interesting. This is just the wiring that we implemented between these L maps and fi maps. Essentially, this is making sure that the feedback from the map encoding spatial locations map onto corresponding retinotopic location in V4, plus some blurring. And similarly, that the fi maps here, the fi maps onto xi with the same selectivity. So this is just essentially the wiring between those areas. But then there are two interesting terms. There are two interesting terms. There are priors over locations, which are being passed from the dorsal stream. And there are priors over features, which themselves would get priors from object identity from within the ventral stream. Okay? So let's see how this, let's see what attention does for this architecture. So first of all, the first mode of operation would be a mode where there is no prior knowledge about the task. I'm not telling the network to do anything, but simply to be. Okay, so I flash a stimulus in front of the network. All the priors are set to uniform, and essentially there are two terms that are going to be driving the response of our xi unit: the feed-forward bottom-up input and this suppressive drive. Okay. What I'm showing you here is the response of, or actually the saliency map here, the posterior probability of locations given the image measurements for three different visual stimuli. What you see here is that if we just present two stimuli, the saliency map returns the location of the two stimuli. There's no a priori difference between an horizontal and a vertical bar. They are equally salient, and so the saliency map returns both locations. What is interesting is that as we increase the density of the distractors here, so you see that the presence of multiple horizontal bars makes the vertical bar in the center much more conspicuous. And you see that the saliency now of the central bar increases. And that's something that's very well known in visual psychophysics, which is called pop-out. Okay? The more similar distractor, the more uniform the background, the easier it is for a target to become salient. And of course, as I increase the number of distractors, you see that the saliency of this center bar increases. Okay? And this is due to the normalization here. This is because as I increase the number of distractors here, the variable associated with this specific feature essentially distributes the evidence across multiple locations. Okay? And that essentially concentrates the weights on the singleton, the vertical bar. Now, more interestingly, we can ask this network to do a couple of things, right? So for instance, I can ask the network to search for a specific target. So the stimulus that I'm showing you here is actually a stimulus that's being used in electrophysiology studies. I'll show you an example from a study from Bob Decimon's lab at MIT. So here, for instance, we can ask the network to look for a specific item in this search array. So I can ask the network to look for the red star here. And what looking for the red star means, we're going to be assuming, as a toy example, that our network encodes two kinds of features at the level of IT. It encodes a red-like feature, and it encodes a star-like feature. Okay. So searching for the red star would correspond to concentrating the priors here around the object identity of the red star In turn, this prior would propagate down the stream onto these FI features here, corresponding to red and star. And then because of the specific wiring, they're going to propagate, they're going to essentially modulate the response of the Xi's, responsive for red and star-like, across the entire visual field. Okay? So the effect of the sequence of message passing here will be given a search for a specific item. All the units in parallel that are selective for features that are diagnostic for this target will get enhanced. Okay? So this is something that people have referred to as parallel feature-based attention. This is something that has been very well documented in psychophysics literature. Just to show you, this is exactly what the experiment by Bichot et al. Showed. Here what they are showing is that they are averaging the response from all the neurons across the visual field, right, where the monkey is searching for one of those targets. And what the important thing to pay attention to here is the essentially positive modulation between this dashed red line and this plain red line, which correspond to the enhancements measured at the neural response for the response of the neurons when the feature that they encode is either diagnostic or non-diagnostic for the search. Okay, so what that shows you is, once again, that if the monkey is looking for a red item, all the red tuned neurons across the board will be enhanced. And that's something that we replicate qualitatively with this network. Conversely, it's also possible to ask the network to do a Posner-like task. So it's possible to cue spatially the network to attend to one specific location. So this would be a what is there kind of task. We tell the network, well, pay attention here and tell us what's located there. Okay? And of course, as in a Posner's task, it's possible to cue over larger or smaller spatial extents, and in a sense modulate the level of certainty about the location of the target. So what spatial cueing would be, the way this is implemented in this network would be by essentially concentrating the priors over location, so concentrating this P of L here right around that location. And of course, the width of the distribution will depend on the size of the spatial extent of the queuing. So now the message, the series of messages that are going to be passed are going the opposite way, right? So before we are going from higher level areas from the ventral stream down the ventral stream onto the dorsal stream. Now the series of messages is reversed. So we're going to have messages being passed from the dorsal stream onto area V4 up the ventral stream. And this is something that people have described as being a case of spatial attention. Now, what is interesting is that our model makes a very specific prediction about the type of enhancements we should expect for the tuning curves of neurons. So what you see here on the left is a classical result from McAdams and Mansell. What they're showing you here is the tuning curve of a neuron in area V4. So this is showing you how the neuron responds on the y-axis for bars at different orientations. The lower curve corresponds to the tuning curve of the neuron when the monkey is attending at a location which does not overlap with the location of the receptive field in space. Okay. What is interesting here is that when the monkey is cued to attend to a location which overlaps with the location of the receptive field, you see an enhancement here. Okay, so this is typical of spatial attention. Our model makes a similar prediction. What is interesting is that it makes further a prediction that the amplitude of the modulation should be directly proportional to, inversely proportional to the size of the spatial queuing. Okay. What essentially the network predicts is that when there is less uncertainty, when the queuing is more constrained spatially, there should be more enhancement at the level of the single cell level. And this is something that should be tested. So the network makes a number of additional predictions. In particular, there has been conflicting results in the attentional literature about the effect of attention when the contrast of the stimulus is being varied. So some group, like Troyer's group, has reported that when the contrast of the stimulus is changed, attention acts more as a shift in the contrast curve. So here, essentially rendering the neuron more sensitive to contrast. While other groups, like McAdams and Mansell, have suggested that the effect of attention on the response curve looks more like a response gain. So essentially a shift of the response curve upward. And so for a while, these results seemed to be essentially inconsistent. But a couple of years ago, Reynolds and Eager suggested that maybe the key difference could be due to differences in the type of experimental paradigm. And so they suggested that in the case of Troyer, in general, the stimuli tended to be smaller. And so the prediction was that perhaps the field of attention or the spotlight of attention for the animal in those cases was much larger than the stimulus. They suggested that maybe in the mouse cell case, the size of the stimulus in comparison to the size of the spotlight would be reversed. Okay? And they had this phenomenological model that they called the normalization model of attention that fulfilled this prediction. It turns out that our model of attention is a special case of their phenomenological model, whereby the prediction is that the normalization essentially should be over all the neighbors in area V4. Okay? And for that reason, we find that our model is consistent with that prediction. Okay. All right, but a little bit more interesting, it's possible to use this network for kind of more real-world search scenarios. So what we did here is that we actually trained the network to localize various kinds of targets in natural scenes. So this is, the database we used is the street scene that was collected a couple of years ago by Stan Bileski at MIT. So this is a database where cars and pedestrians have been fully annotated. There is something like a couple of thousand images. So what does it mean to train the network to search for objects? Well, that means a couple of things. First of all, that means learning the kinds of the right priors for those objects. And learning the right priors means learning the kinds of stuff that these objects are made of. So learning that pedestrians are kind of this vertical-like structure. And so essentially learning to set higher priors for units tuned to vertical-like things. Learning that cars tend to be more horizontal-like structures, and so essentially learning to set a higher weight onto the more horizontally tuned units. In the case of priors over attention, prior over location, we considered global contextual cues. So contextual cues are known. There's a pretty large literature suggesting that they play a very important role in attention and predicting eye movements. So what we did here is essentially considered a global representation for images, essentially learning a global mapping for every individual images, trying to predict the locations of objects from that. And so this is building heavily on work by Antonio Torralba at MIT. What we get out of this network is essentially, or this contextual cues, is a set of prior locations or expected locations for objects. And we use that as a prior over our L variable. So just another way to think of that is that we expect pedestrians to be on sidewall-like structures and cars to be more on road-like structures, and those are the kind of things that can be predicted from the gist of the scene or the overall layout of the scene. So we wanted to compare predictions about interesting area in these images to human eye movements. The reason why we care about human eye movements is there is a theory of attention which is called the premotor theory of attention, which suggests that before you can move your eyes to a location, about 150 milliseconds before you get there, you need to deploy your attention at that very location. Okay, so in other words, it's you tend to shift your attention at more location than you move your eyes, but at least we know that with good hope that wherever you move your eyes, you've been attending before. So it's possible to use eye movements as a proxy for attention. So what we did essentially consider a small subset of the street scene database, and we asked human observers to count the number of either cars or pedestrians in those images. And we did that in different blocks so that the same image sometimes could be used in a car search task and sometimes in a pedestrian search task. So we had 8 pedestrians. These 2 conditions were blocked. Each image was presented twice, and we recorded human eye movements with an infrared eye tracker. So what I'm going to be doing here is that we're going to be essentially, running the network, and we're going to be using the posterior probability of L given those images as a saliency map. We're going to try to use the values, the saliency values here. We are hoping that the higher this value, the more predictive it is of human eye fixations. So we're going to use that and compare that to actual human eye data. So the way we did that is standard. This is using an ROC measure. Essentially, this is starting, essentially varying the threshold, considering all the possible values on this map, starting from the highest to the lowest value. If we do that and consider the number of pixels that are higher than this value, we can essentially consider parts of those saliency map that extend, they would start with a single pixel and then extend, grow more and more. And of course, the more this region grow, the more likely we are to get a human eye fixations to hit this area. Okay. So essentially, one way to think of that is essentially a 3D plot, and essentially moving this plane here from the top towards the bottom, and for every level of the threshold, counting how many human eye fixations would fall, in this part here above the plane. So this is to give you an example. These green areas here correspond, for instance, to the top 20%, so the predicted most likely 20% of the image to be fixated by human eye movements. So in this case, we would have two errors. There are two eye fixations that fall outside this 20%. Here, this would be 100% hit rate for the model. Here, we would be missing one, and then 100% again. Okay. So that's how we measure the agreement between our model and human eye movements. All right. So here are the results. First, I'm going to show you results for the car. So we first started with the simplest thing possible, which is to ask about the role of the priors that we've learned. So we set all the priors to be uniform. Okay, so here the model is not looking for anything in particular, no specific object. The model doesn't know anything about contextual cues, so it's essentially free viewing. It's just looking at the salience, bottom-up salient stuff in those scenes. And so to my surprise, at least, we were higher than chance. So that means that just bottom-up saliency is already able to account for some of the human eye fixations, well above chance. So now putting in the feature priors, that is essentially setting the right kinds of priors for the right kinds of objects, we see a significant improvement in the ability of the model to predict human eye fixations. Now, adding on top of that the contextual spatial priors, which are driven by global cues, we see that we further increase the ability of the model to explain human eye movements. What I'm showing here as the last plot is essentially our best possible model. This is measuring the intersubject agreements. Okay, so if we look at essentially this is the best we can do. If we look at the distance between our bar here to the human eye movement, to the intersubject agreements, we get above 92% accuracy. Okay, which is actually quite high. This was surprising to me. And we get very similar results for cars and pedestrians. It seems that for cars, the feature prior seems to be a little bit more useful than for pedestrians. And I think it's because still the kinds of representation we're using in our model is still too limited, and I think there were a lot of confusion between actually pedestrians and poles in those scenes. All right, so this was a specific visual search. Similarly, we can actually try to simulate this model on databases of free viewing conditions. So here the participants are not being asked to do anything at all. They're just asked to look around those images. So we set all the priors to be uniform, and actually our model by itself performed relatively well in comparison to other bottom-up models. All right, so that's pretty much it. I've described a computational framework whereby attention is part of the inference process that tries to solve the visual recognition problem of what is where. Within this framework, the main goal of the visual system is to infer the identity and the position of objects in visual scenes. I've shown you that spatial attention, which are the kinds of messages we pass from the dorsal stream onto the ventral stream, emerges as a strategy to reduce the uncertainty in shape information, while feature-based attention, which was the opposite, going from the ventral to the dorsal stream, reduces the uncertainty in spatial information. Overall, we've shown that feature and spatial attention represent just two distinct modes of a computational process that tries to solve the problem of recognizing and localizing objects, especially when the task is difficult, that is when clutter is present. Just as a side note, just to repeat one thing that I said, again, we use belief propagation in this specific implementation, but in general, our model is agnostic about the algorithm used. And in particular, I do not claim anything specific about or special about the biological plausibility of belief propagation. And then overall, as an overall summary of this series of three lectures, I've tried to highlight this idea of two modes of visual perception. I've tried to suggest that rapid bottom-up feed-forward processing would be suitable to describe the very early stages of visual processing, what I would call a base coarse initial representation, which lasts for the first 150 milliseconds of visual processing. I've tried to convince you that this very coarse initial representation is sufficient for recognizing relatively salient objects, ideal in isolation or with limited amount of clutter. But I've shown you as well that the ability of this feed-forward bottom-up sweep to deal with clutter is relatively limited. What our computational framework suggests, and I've shown you experimental evidence for that, is that top-down recurrent feedback is actually needed to deal with the problem of clutter, and also for object localization. So let me just leave the acknowledgements. Actually, I should emphasize the work of a couple of talented students. So Shahad Shiker did all of the model simulations on attention. Ying Zhang did the monkey electrophysiology in Bob DeSimon's lab, and Ethan Meyers conducted the decoding analysis. I should emphasize as well that all of the work that I described is work that I did as a postdoc in the Poggio lab already 2 years ago. Thank you very much.